Welcome back everyone to this second lecture on mass victimisation. So again, of course, we're using the example of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And last week we talked over quite a lot of a timeline of how a nation gets to the point that you have the possibility of a whole nation of ordinary people basically turning into killers. And we talked over a lot of the complexities around how that sort of thing can unfold. We also discussed the definition that can be applied for the term genocide. So when a nation or a large group of people in a nation are alleged as having committed genocide or being suspected of committing genocide, the definition that the UN use, and indeed the UN Convention related to genocide that is applied in those cases. But there is this question then that what happens afterwards? So what happens once a genocide has happened? So once a genocide is at its end point and a nation is beginning to recover from this. Now usually, because genocide is often primarily perpetrated by a state itself, often the state and the key members of the state that were involved in that genocide would be the ones, of course, that are held to account, although in many cases they may well have fled the country or gone into exile or become fugitives elsewhere. But usually speaking, we have a new state that is being formed, or rather a new government within a state that's being formed, and they are then tasked, they are the ones, this new government are the ones that are tasked with the horrible aftermath of what on earth do we do to try as a nation, as a country, as a people and a community, a nation, how do we recover from this? How do we possibly come back from an event whereby there's been the loss of 1 million lives, hundreds of thousands more in exile or injured, or indeed an entire nation traumatised, as we've talked about previously? How do we begin to deal with that? Of course, in the seminar that we did related to the assessment, we talked over policing. We talked over how the new police was formed in Rwanda in order to try and police a post-genocide state whereby the entire nation is vulnerable. But that's, of course, only a small part of what might have to happen in the event of the aftermath of something like a genocide. There is that conundrum of, well, what do you do with so many genocide suspects? I mean, again, we're talking about potentially up to 2 million suspects, not all of which, of course, were involved in killing, but they may have been involved in other acts related to genocide. They may have assisted those that were doing the killing. They may have looted properties. They may have caused serious harm or injury to other individuals. All sorts of other sorts of criminal acts, which again you can see listed in the convention that we talked about last week, which would still be classed as acts of genocide. And complicity to genocide, of course, is one of those as well. So how do you begin to deal with that? Well, once the people that have been accused have gone through a specific trial process, and we're not going to talk about the trial process here, that's something that we talked about in the transitional justice little part of the contemporary studies module last term. But there was a sort of a homegrown solution that was used by the Rwandan people, a sort of traditional court system called Gacaca Courts that were used. And if you want to, you can look up the history and the functioning of Gacaca Courts in your own time if you like. But ultimately, as with any trial process, there does end up being a large number of people who are convicted that then have to go to prison, because for the sorts of offences that we're talking about related to genocide, these are the sorts of offences that in the vast majority of cases would result in a prison sentence. Now, the existing prisons, of course, in the country were simply not equipped to deal with this amount of convictions at any one time. You know, in most nations have a relatively steady rate of convictions. Sometimes there are growths or reductions, but ordinarily crime is only fluctuates to a certain extent from year to year. And so the likes of the number of prisons and the facilities prisons have are not really designed to deal with a situation where en masse we have hundreds of thousands of people being accused in a relatively short space of time, i.e. over the course of, let's say, a decade or so. And so, of course, new prisons had to be built. And one of those prisons that was built, which I've visited a couple of times, is Nyanza prison. So it's actually called Mpanga prison, but it's in Nyanza. And this prison is in the south of Rwanda. And the reason this was built really was to house, as well as ordinary perpetrators of genocide, also a number of those that were more high-level perpetrators of the genocide. Because when it comes to individuals being prosecuted through a UN court or a UN tribunal, as was the case with Rwanda, whereby the high-level perpetrators were prosecuted through the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, those that are convicted there, the UN has got certain standards that it requires the prisons that people are sent to have. So there's certain standards, and very few of the prisons in Rwanda at that time would have met that particular standard. And so Nyanza prison was purpose-built to meet UN standards. And as a result, what this has actually meant is that in this particular prison in Rwanda, it's actually not just convicts from the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda that are housed here. About 20 years or so ago, there was also a major loss of life, shall we say, a major human rights disaster in Sierra Leone. And those that were guilty of committing the crimes in Sierra Leone, a large number of those high-level perpetrators that were convicted at the Special Court for Sierra Leone are also held at Nyanza prison in Rwanda. So this is actually an international prison. It is Rwanda's prison, but it's an international standard prison that the UN uses to house suspects, not only the ordinary suspects, or the ordinary convicts rather, the ordinary convicts from the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, but also a number of high-level perpetrators, both from Rwanda and from other serious issues such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc. So Nyanza prison, and again I've got some photos here that we can see here, where you can see the likes of the open spaces that exist. Now, of course, like any prison, there's high walls round about the prison, there's guards, and the guards have guns very much. But the prison maybe isn't quite what you would expect, in that it's not that prisoners are kept at all times in, small cells. Yes, there are cell blocks, and again I've got some pictures of these here, that prisoners may be kept within when they're sleeping, let's say. But during the daytime, there's large open spaces that the prisoners are treated with humanity again. They're treated like human beings. And so there are open spaces. A good example that I can give you is that they do become involved in all sorts of activities that are intended to enable them to be able to function in normal life when they come out of prison. So when they have people that go to visit, there are certain crafts, certain things that the inmates have made that they can actually sell to visitors to the prison. And again, when I use the word visitors to the prison, it's not like it's a tourist attraction. You cannot go there without explicit approval from the government. So it's not like you can just rock up and go in and they've got little craft stalls. No, it's not like that at all. But they do know in advance, of course, when visitors are going to be coming to the prison. And so there are things that are set up then that the prisoners have made that allow you to actually go and recognise the good work that they've done, and to buy with a little bit of money, and it's very cheap, some of the things that they've made there. And indeed in my own home I've got a couple of examples of the things that have been made by prisoners, which are unbelievably good quality and display real craftsmanship and skill. So anyway, we have Nyanza prison, and that's just one example of a prison. And again, you can see here, we were given explicit permission for one member of our group to take photographs. And so the photographs that we have here that I'm showing you are actual photographs. These aren't stock photographs. These are photographs that have been taken on the visits that I have been to the prison. And so you can see, the wide open spaces, but then you can also see around some of the accommodation blocks where it's a bit more cramped, where the ordinary suspects or the ordinary convicts, because the picture that you can see here with what looks like an enclosed square in the middle of some accommodation blocks, that's the normal, if you would say, normal genocide convicts that are in that particular block. There's a separate block which exists, which is specific to the high-level perpetrators. And it can be a bit uncomfortable going in there. And I've spoken in particular to some of those that were convicted from Sierra Leone. And they have, relatively large rooms. They've got hi-fis. They've got a TV room that they can go into. So that can be a little bit uncomfortable, because you might think, well, is that really punishment? But then you realise that some of the people in there are going to be in there for, 25, 30 years or potentially for life in some cases. And so, there's a degree of comfort on one hand, but the severe restriction of freedom, of course, on the other hand. But it is interesting that you can see that the different categories of perpetrators are actually treated differently, with the ordinary perpetrators in quite cramped conditions, although they are again allowed out into the public spaces, of course, for certain parts of the day. And then the high-level perpetrators, those that were the masterminds, if you like, that have a bit more comfort around them in their own individual rooms. But ultimately, at some point, particularly if we're not talking about those masterminds, if you are talking about the ordinary perpetrators, let's say those that might have been involved in killing, or might have been involved in other not quite as serious acts, involving serious injury or property damage, those sorts of things. Ultimately, those people will have to come back into their communities at some point. And you might say, well, why do they have to go back to their communities? Why can't they go elsewhere? Well, think about this. If you've got hundreds of thousands of perpetrators and they're all going to be drip feeding back out of prison, what would you propose? Would you propose that we give the victims one half of the country and the perpetrators the other half of the country? Because that would just be exacerbating divisions yet again. It would again be creating a them and us situation, which would be a recipe for absolute disaster. And so that's not something that is done. And the reality is that the logistics of the amount of victims and the amount of perpetrators is such that really there's no other option other than for perpetrators and victims each to be going back to their old towns, villages, their old homes. And that, of course, brings its own challenges as well, because could you imagine a situation whereby you were a victim, a survivor, and you had lost children, you had lost parents, you had lost siblings, and then all of a sudden one day, 10 or 15 years later, you hear movement in the house next door, and lo and behold, it's the very person that actually massacred some of your family. Just imagine what you might be feeling there. And in the second half of this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of that, about precisely what victims have been saying or have said in the past. But of course, that sort of situation whereby somebody might come back would be a shock. It would be a shock to the system for the victims, for the survivors. And so Rwanda was very careful and has been very careful to try and avoid that shock factor being possible, and to try and avoid that jolt and potential for conflict to happen under those circumstances. Because, of course, as soon as somebody was to come back to their community cold like that, if you like, where there was no prior knowledge, then there is every possibility that there may be a conflict that would arise. Someone who was a survivor would naturally be furious, angry, PTSD, potentially trauma coming back to haunt them, and they may lash out. They may want retribution against that individual. They may want to go and kill that individual. And that really wouldn't be doing anybody, the country, the survivor, or of course the perpetrator who's now dead, wouldn't be doing them any good at all. And so, to try and avoid that shock, Rwanda was thinking, well, or the Rwandan state was thinking, well, how do we try and avoid that? What can we do to try and reintegrate, being the appropriate word, reintegrate perpetrators back into societies that they harmed in some way? And there is a French term, TIG, it's TIG, that effectively would be loosely it would be loosely translated as either a work camp or a community service camp. And so Rwanda created TIG camps, community service camps, which were set up round about the outskirts of certain villages, towns, areas. And rather than perpetrators, when their sentence is finished, being simply sent back into their communities, what would ordinarily happen is that the perpetrators would be, that if their sentence usually commuted slightly, so say they were given a 12-year sentence, let's say, they might serve 10 of those years in prison, and then the remaining 2 years they might serve, they might then move halfway out of prison towards their communities. They would move to one of these TIG camps or community service camps, which is close to the community that they're intending on going back to. And for that remaining 2 years, as part of that community service camp, that TIG camp, they would then be conducting activities and doing work that is directly beneficial to the communities that they wronged. So you would have, let's say, someone that let's say someone that burned down the house of a Tutsi, and let's say they weren't involved in killing, but they burned down the house of a Tutsi, and that Tutsi family now lives in a relative's house somewhere else in the village. That perpetrator, as part of their TIG community service work, might, with a group of others, go to that area where the house was burnt down and might actually help to build a brand new house for that family. So it's literally a form of restorative or reparative justice. That the intention is that these individuals can then be seen in society. These perpetrators that wrong society will then, for a significant period of time, be seen again by victims, by survivors, by ordinary people back in that locality, doing good for that community. And again, that's just an example of building house, so it could be all sorts of other things they could be doing. But the idea would be that they may be then helping the communities that they directly caused damage to. So they become a known face in the community again, but rather than automatically being associated with the violent acts, the dangerous and criminal acts that they committed, gradually the hope is that over that, let's say, 2 or 3 years that they're at the TIG camp, they can also begin to be associated with genuinely feeling remorse and genuinely doing what they can to try and make good as best they can, whatever actions, whatever damage, whatever harm they caused. So the idea then being that they become known in the community again, that the survivors that might initially have been extremely angry might still be angry, but they might not feel that same, let's say, impulse upon seeing that person again to want retribution, because they've gradually been reacclimatized, I suppose, but gradually become reused to that individual being at least a small part of the community and visually being able to see the work that they're doing to try and make up for whatever the harm was that they caused. So that the aim being that at the end of that 2 or 3 year period in the TIG camp, that when they do go back into the community again, that it's been a sort of a slower transition, a slower reintegration into society again. And again, I want to emphasise here, there's quite a lot of theories that you could look up on reintegration in general. There's a lot of different theories of reintegration and rehabilitation that you could apply to the Rwandan case here. So I'll flash up a couple of terms here on the screen for you for some of those different theories of reintegration that you might wish to look to. And one of the things that might surprise you, if you were to go and visit one of these TIG camps, one of the things that might surprise you is that they're ordinary people. These people, quite often, if you're looking at a group of people, and I've done this in classes before where it's been in person, where I've got videos of singing and dancing at these TIG camps, because as well as the work that they do, there's also things like psychosocial support. There's also the activities to try and build these people as a community. And importantly as well, because by this time, 10, 12, 14, 15, 20, 30 years on, by the time we get to 30 years on, a lot of these people that were perpetrators have come to understand, they really have come to understand, that in reality they'd been basically brainwashed through propaganda, and a lot of those have been, I hesitate to say reconditioned because that's got all sorts of negative connotations, but they've been helped to understand the conditions that they thought they knew for 20 or 30 years under Kayibanda and Habyarimana were in fact not true. That a lot of the hate that they had felt had been really implanted within them. And so a lot of these people now, perpetrators now, a lot of them, not all of them, don't get me wrong, not all of them, but a lot of them now do have genuine remorse, and they genuinely have feelings of self-loathing, and they've lost all sorts of confidence that they might have had. And so these activities that do go on at the TIG camps are intended to actually, again, instill a sense of community, a sense of pride within these individuals, to know that when they go back to their communities that they can still be a functioning member of society and they still have something to give. And it'd be very easy for someone coming out of a prison situation where they've been incarcerated for a long period of time. It'd be very easy for them to believe that they're hopeless, that they've got nothing more they can give to a community, that why should anybody forgive me or want to give me a job, these sorts of things. And so some of these activities at the camps are designed to instill that sense of community, that pride back in these people again. And so when you do go there to these TIG camps, and again, you have to get permission to go to them, but I've been to these a few times, and there will be activities that involve things like singing and dancing and crafts and all of these sorts of things. And I've showed these videos of singing and dancing at the TIG camps before to people and said, what do you think you're seeing here? And a lot of the responses that we get quite often are things like, oh, it's it's a group of people having a party. Maybe it's people that work in a factory because they're wearing overalls and they're having a party and they're laughing and joking. And in the video, you'll see quite a lot of women, for example. And I don't think there's really been a time when I've then told the class, well, actually, what you're looking at here is everyone on that screen that you're seeing, aside from the guards that you see, are genocidaires. They're killers. They're people that perpetrated genocide. And there's quite often a shocked response or a very surprised response from the class when I say that, and I'll ask them questions about, well, why, what about this would not make you think that was the case? And often response will be, well, a lot of them are women. Because again, the sort of intuitive image that we have of someone that's conducting or carrying out genocide or killing is quite often that they'll be male. And of course, most actually were male, but there was also a very large number of women that perpetrated genocide in Rwanda in 1994 as well. So some of the first response might be the surprise at the women. There's then also the surprise at the fact that these are people that are happy and dancing. And more so because the term that quite often has been used is, well, they just seem like ordinary people. And that's where I have to explain that, well, the reality is that most of the killers in Rwanda were and are, in fact, ordinary people. It's ordinary people that were programmed to hate. And so you're quite often seeing this scene of seeing the individuals in their true context as being just ordinary people can have a bit of a rehumanizing effect. And again, I've got some photos here that you can see at the moment that you're looking through of the TIG camps and the individuals involved. And one of my absolute favourite images that I took, and again I took this photo, one of my absolute favourite images of all time, probably in any context, not just related to Rwanda, is this little photo that I'm putting up on screen here just now for you. So the people at TIG camp are allowed, first of all, they can apply for day release if they want to go back to their families. They can apply for, I can't remember exactly, it's almost like holiday leave. They can actually apply to go back for a weekend to their, to their family home. If they need to sort out things like financial affairs, or if they might have a job interview for when they're going to come out of the TIG camp, they're allowed to apply for leave to go and do these things. And the other way around as well, they're also allowed visitors to come to the TIG camp to see them. And so the grandchild of one of the perpetrators, one of the times that I was at TIG camp, one of the grandchildren, a young boy, was there. And this photo that I've got here, I think really does humanise the situation to you, whereby you can see the drum. This is a drum here that they've got because they were doing some singing and dancing at this point. And the little boy, of course, was really interested in what this drum was and was sort of crawling around about it and standing up and holding on. And you can see the reaction of some of these people that are genocidaires. Those are people that were convicted of genocide offences. But you can really see the humanity here. You can see how almost delighted these big hard men are at this young child that's playing around about them. And I think this is really what, for me, instills a great sense of hope. A great sense of hope that in the future, once all of these individuals are back in society, because there are an awful lot now of perpetrators back in society, but in the future, once all are back into society, this rehumanisation, I feel like this rehumanisation process, I think hopefully in the long term bodes well for Rwanda, and that there would hopefully not be a re-escalation of that violence, because you can see these are human beings, you can see that they've got thoughts and feelings, and they're probably damaged by the experiences. And you could argue that they're just as much damaged, well, maybe that's a bit of an insult, but you could argue that they are damaged in a different way, but damaged just as the victims are damaged, the survivors are damaged. Of course, we do not want in any way to compare the experience of the perpetrators with the experience of the victims and survivors from that sense. But the reality is that a number of these perpetrators will also be deeply traumatised, particularly those that committed these acts when they were very young. You know, those that were encouraged to become involved in this sort of killing when they were 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, that were incredibly young, and they knew from birth nothing but hate and division. in spite of whatever horrific acts they may have carried out during the genocide in 1994, in spite of those horrific acts, I think it would be incredibly cold-hearted not to understand that those individuals are also, to a large extent, victims. They weren't victims in that they were victimised through the genocide. So they're not victims of genocide, so to speak, but they're lifelong victims, if you like, of the way that they were brought up, the way that they were used as pawns to carry out these horrific acts. And the reality is that these are people that still should have potential, because even now, 26 years on from that genocide, someone that was 16 then is still only 40 years old now, or 42 years old now. They still could, have a career ahead of them, a 20 or 25-year career ahead of them. And they have the potential to do that. A lot of them have the potential to do that. And so we shouldn't be simply writing off these individuals and saying, well, they were involved in the genocide, therefore they're nothing, and that they should be treated as persona non grata. I think the reality is that we should view things differently from that, and that the reality is that Rwanda does view things differently than that. They do try to reintegrate perpetrators back into society and enable them to have some sort of ordinary functioning life. Now, the next thing that's important to mention briefly as well is that I'm very well aware that we've concentrated, when we've been talking about the state in Rwanda prior to 1994, so when we've been talking about Juvenal Habyarimana and his MRND government, for example, when we've been talking about them, or even Kayibanda before them, we have been, of course, talking very negatively about the state in Rwanda at that time. And it'd be very easy then for not only the Rwandan people, but also for you and I to think very negatively about the entire Rwandan state at that time. And it's important that the new generation of Rwandan people trust the state, trust the government, because it'd be very easy for them to have lost all trust and faith, because a government that was supposed to protect them up until 1994 turned their back and both planned and actively participated in organising a genocide, the mass killing of its own people, regardless of ethnic identity divisions. The Tutsi people were still very much citizens of Rwanda. And so it'd be very easy now for any individual in Rwanda to simply not have any trust or faith in the state. And so it is important to contextualise the state itself prior to 1994, or in the build-up to 1994, and explain that the problem is that the majority of the government, let's say, so not just everybody involved in the state, not every individual of the state, but the primary members of the government, let's say Habyarimana's cabinet, were all, of course, hardline Hutu power fanatics. It was them that harboured this genocidal ideology, if you would call it that, this genocidal ideology whereby they did design the policies that caused division. They were the ones that implemented and allowed to carry on things like division in education, division geographically, with Tutsi being sent to certain areas of the country to live. Those sorts of policies and practices were very much those that were designed, implemented and maintained by Habyarimana's close alliances within the government. But it is important for you to realise that not every member of the state was like that. So although all members of the state at that time were Hutu, or were identified as Hutu, rather, not all were quite as fanatical in their beliefs with regard to ethnic division as those at the very top end of government. There were a large number of members of the state that were more moderate, you would say. So they might have been part of the government and gone along with it, but a bit like in the UK, whereby you will have some members of either the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, SNP, that they might broadly align with a party's politics, but there are certain things that they don't agree on, and they're not quite as, let's say, far to the right or far to the left as some within the party. So there's, as with any party, the MRND in Rwanda had a sort of a sliding scale of, I suppose what you would say, fanaticism within it. And there were some that were more moderate in their beliefs. Now, there were very few that would have been active Tutsi supporters, shall we say, because that would have probably had them expelled from the party. But there were certainly some that would not have been complicit with genocide or other violence taking place. So although they might have believed to some extent in differences between ethnic identities and ethnic groups, they wouldn't have encouraged or been complicit in violence being perpetrated against those groups, and may have been more encouraging of things like peace talks. And there will have been some that were more encouraging of the new government of unity that was supposed to be created through the Arusha Accords that we talked about last week. So there were some members of the government that were supportive of a power-sharing agreement. Now, as you can imagine, when the genocide then happened and began in April 1994, it would have been crucial for anyone that was not hardline, whether it was in general society or indeed in the state, to be removed. And so to that extent, any member of the state that was regarded as being moderate in their belief, or supportive of the peace talks, or supportive of the proposed power-sharing government, anyone that was sympathetic to the Tutsi cause, let's say, was a target for removal, shall we say. And by removal, of course, what we mean is to be killed, to be assassinated. And so there were, in actual fact, both at national state and local state level, because of course there were local authorities in Rwanda as well as the national government, but all of those members of the state that were regarded as being potentially an obstacle to the genocide, an obstacle to the killing of Tutsi, any of those members of the state, even if they were Hutu, were targeted for extermination. And so I've got a photograph here of, there is a specific memorial for state victims that's in Rwanda that you can go and visit. Now you actually have to get permission, unlike a lot of the other memorial sites that you go to visit in Rwanda, which are open and tourist attractions, if you like. I hesitate to use that term, but anybody that goes to Rwanda would be encouraged to go and visit some of these memorial sites to understand better what happened in Rwanda in 1994. But there is also a memorial for state victims that, again, you have to get permission to go and see because of the dangers that this sort of memorial could be defaced, this is a more likely sort of memorial to be targeted for whether it is to be defaced or things like terrorism activities, these sorts of things. But you can get permission to go and view the state memorial if you apply for it in advance. And you will see there, and again you'll see in the photo, that on the wall that is here, there's a whole number of graves that are here, but there's also a large wall with the names of all of the state victims that were killed through the genocide, and also the families of the state victims, because often, of course, what would happen is when the person was being targeted, they weren't sitting in their state office, they were often at home, and so the Interahamwe or other genocidaires would go to that home of the member of the state, and they would usually massacre that person and their entire family. Because that would, of course, ensure there were no witnesses to what happened as well. So on this wall, you will see the sheer number of members of the state that were murdered because they would not be complicit in the genocide. So this is an important location for you to go and see. Do you want to say hi? Say hi to Daddy's phone.
Hi.
No, up there.
Oh, hi.
Right, you need to go. Apologies for that short interruption there. So yeah, we were just talking about these state victims. So you can see when you go to this memorial site the sheer number of victims, state victims that there in fact were. And hopefully this would maybe temper your understanding of who and what the state were in Rwanda. Whereby, yes, the majority were hardline. Yes, the state as a whole body was responsible for the genocide ultimately that unfolded, but that not everybody that was part of that state was somebody that harboured this genocidal ideology and these beliefs that they wanted everybody killed, every Tutsi killed rather. So this might instill some confidence moving forwards that when we are moving through the current phase that we are now, 25, 26 years after the genocide, that people can have faith in the state, and it wasn't the entire state that failed them, but it was certain members of that state. And so moving forwards, the hope would be that sort of hard line ideology would never be allowed to creep into any state institution again, and that the ordinary people in Rwanda should be able to trust the state as it exists today. So next we're going to be moving on to talk about the victims themselves, so the survivors. So we have been talking quite a lot around about the idea of perpetrators, a lot around about the idea of the state and what happened, but specifically thinking about the victims, the survivors themselves. What do victims want? What do survivors want to happen? So in the aftermath of something like a genocide, in the aftermath of the events whereby you may have a survivor that's lost their entire family, or their spouse, or their children, or friends, or may have lost their home, or other things, what is it that victims or survivors are saying that they would actually want from the aftermath of a genocide? What do they want for the future? What do they want to happen to the perpetrators? These are key questions. Remembering that in the aftermath of something like a genocide, actually reassuring the survivors that something like this can never happen again, will never be allowed to happen again, is incredibly important. And so the survivors need to have a real faith that the justice system will be working in their favour. And so in part 2 of this lecture today, we're going to be talking in detail about what victims actually want from justice in the aftermath of a genocide. So we're going to be talking about that in part 2, and we'll see you again then.